Each year, naval forces across the globe conduct thousands of classified deep-sea operations involving experimental sonar technology, acoustic warfare systems, and submarine detection methods that push the absolute boundaries of what we understand about sound propagation in extreme oceanic environments. It happens so frequently that specialized divisions within the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Soviet Navy's main intelligence directorate, and NATO's Supreme Allied Command Atlantic have dedicated entire departments to investigating acoustic anomalies that occur at depths where sunlight has never penetrated and where pressure exceeds 16,000 pounds per square inch, with annual budgets approaching $500 million in today's currency. The Cold War submarine operations of the mid-1980s saw unprecedented technological escalation, with both superpowers deploying over 300 nuclear submarines worldwide, each vessel carrying crews of 60 to 100 highly trained personnel into depths that remained more mysterious than the surface of Mars, creating conditions where the line between experimental military technology and forces beyond human comprehension became terrifyingly thin. For a brief period during the spring of 1986, one elite American deep submergence rescue team would encounter something so profoundly disturbing aboard a drifting Soviet nuclear submarine that it would fundamentally alter how naval intelligence agencies approach acoustic warfare research and would result in specific coordinates in the Mariana Trench being permanently classified as restricted military zones with shoot-on-sight authorization for any vessel that approaches within a 5 nautical mile radius. But what exactly was the entity that Soviet Captain Mikhail Dmitrievich Volkov's experimental sonar array awakened from the deepest trenches of the Pacific Ocean? And why did an entire 90-man crew simply vanish from their posts, while every single system aboard the K-432 continued functioning perfectly, as if the submarine itself had become a floating tomb, waiting for its next victims? The Mariana Trench stretches across approximately 2,550 kilometers of the western Pacific Ocean floor, representing the deepest oceanic trench on planet Earth, with its lowest point, the Challenger Deep, plunging to a staggering 10.9994 meters below sea level, creating an environment where the water pressure becomes so immense that it would instantly crush an unprotected human body into something no larger than a marble within mere seconds of exposure. This region sits roughly 320 kilometers southwest of Guam, where tectonic plates collide in a subduction zone that's been grinding against each other for over 50 million years, producing an underwater landscape of jagged volcanic peaks, thermal vents spewing superheated chemical compounds, and trenches so profound that if Mount Everest were placed at the bottom, its peak would still remain over 2 kilometers beneath the ocean's surface. The water temperature at these extreme depths hovers just above freezing at approximately 2 degrees Celsius. The complete absence of sunlight creates perpetual darkness more absolute than any cave system on land, and the geological activity produces constant low-frequency vibrations that travel through the water for thousands of kilometers, creating what naval acousticians call the deep sound channel, where certain frequencies can propagate almost indefinitely without significant loss of intensity. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that this lightless abyss where pressure, darkness, and geological forces create conditions utterly alien to surface-dwelling life would harbor phenomena that challenge everything humanity believes it understands about the limits of biological adaptation and the nature of consciousness itself. Ancient Micronesian seafaring cultures who navigated these waters for over 3,000 years developed elaborate oral traditions warning against what they called Ya Submarine, which translates roughly to the voice that comes from below the world, describing a phenomenon where fishermen who ventured too far into certain waters during specific lunar phases would return to shore bleeding from their ears and speaking in confused, fragmented sentences about sounds that came from beneath their outrigger canoes, sounds that made their teeth vibrate and their bones ache as if something massive and impossibly ancient was singing to them from the ocean floor. Historical records from Spanish colonial expeditions in the 1600s documented similar encounters, with Captain Vicente de Araluce recording in his ship's log dated August 17, 1643, that his crew experienced what he described as El Canto del Abismo, the Song of the Abyss, while sailing near these coordinates, noting that 3 sailors died with blood streaming from every orifice in their bodies, while the ship's bell rang continuously, despite no one touching it, vibrating so intensely that it eventually cracked straight down its center. Japanese Imperial Navy records from World War II contain classified reports of submarine I-73 detecting acoustic anomalies of unknown biological origin at extreme depths near these same coordinates in February 1944, with the vessel's sonar operator, Petty Officer Takeshi Yamamoto, writing in his final transmission that the sounds were not mechanical, not whale song, not geological, but something that responds when we ping it, something that seems to be learning the frequency of our equipment. Before all contact with I-73 was permanently lost, and the submarine was never recovered, despite extensive search operations. The United States Navy's own classified archives contain at least 14 separate incidents between 1960 and 1985 involving submarines that reported unexplained acoustic phenomena in deep Pacific trenches, with varying degrees of crew casualties that were officially attributed to equipment malfunctions, pressure hull failures, or in one particularly disturbing case from 1978, mass psychogenic illness triggered by prolonged isolation stress. Despite the fact that the affected submarine, USS Guitarro, was found with its entire sonar room damaged beyond recognition, with equipment panels showing signs of having vibrated so violently that solid steel mounting brackets had sheared completely off their welds. Similar encounters were reported by Soviet Northern Fleet submarines operating in the Kurila-Kamchatka Trench in 1981, where Captain First Rank Sergei Antonovich Kulikov documented what he termed hostile acoustic entities that caused his vessel's hull plating to resonate at frequencies that induced severe nausea and disorientation in his crew, forcing an emergency surface that resulted in his immediate court-martial for spreading superstitious nonsense detrimental to Soviet naval readiness, though his detailed acoustic recordings were quietly transferred to a special research directorate that officially does not exist in any organizational chart. The pattern that emerges from these scattered, heavily redacted reports suggests something profoundly disturbing. That certain frequencies, when projected into specific deep ocean environments under particular conditions, can elicit responses from something that exists at depths where conventional biology should be utterly impossible. Something that appears to possess not just reactive capability, but genuine predatory intelligence. Something that has been waiting in the crushing darkness of the deepest trenches since long before humans ever conceived of descending into those lightless depths to disturb its domain. April 5, 1986, 08:47 hours local time, the deep submergence rescue vehicle Mystic detached from its mothership, the USS Ortolan, positioned approximately 40 nautical miles northeast of the last known coordinates of the Soviet Akula-class nuclear submarine K-432, which had been drifting in complete radio silence for 22 days after American KH-11 reconnaissance satellites detected its distinctive thermal signature, sitting motionless at periscope depth in international waters. A situation so unprecedented that it had triggered emergency consultations between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA's Soviet Analysis Division within hours of confirmation. Commander James Patrick Hendricks, call sign Ironside, a 15-year veteran of underwater rescue operations who'd personally extracted 17 sailors from the wreckage of various submarines during his career, and who possessed the kind of unshakable calm that only comes from having stared death in the face at crushing depths and walked away, led his 5-person team through their final equipment checks with methodical precision, each member knowing that entering a potentially compromised Soviet nuclear vessel represented not just a rescue operation, but an intelligence opportunity that could shift the balance of Cold War submarine warfare technology. Lieutenant Liam Smith, second-in-command and navigation specialist, monitored the descent trajectory, while Petty Officer Rachel Vance, the team's medical specialist and only woman in the unit, reviewed her emergency medical protocols for radiation exposure, decompression injuries, and chemical contamination scenarios. Chief Petty Officer David Kowalski, a gruff Chicago-born engineer who could rebuild a submarine's propulsion system blindfolded and who'd served on diesel boats before the nuclear age, ran diagnostics on their cutting equipment and hull breach tools, while Seaman Thomas Riley, barely 23 years old, but possessing an almost supernatural ability to troubleshoot communication systems under pressure, established their tether link to the ortolan above. Petty Officer First Class Andre Baptiste, a Haitian-American sonar technician whose acute hearing had earned him the nickname Ears, and who could identify specific submarine classes by their acoustic signatures alone, sat hunched over his monitoring station, with headphones pressed tight against his skull, already detecting something that made his expression tighten with professional concern. As the Mystic descended through progressively darker water, the pressure gauge climbing steadily toward numbers that represented environments utterly hostile to human life. The water temperature dropped from 18 degrees Celsius at the surface to barely 4 degrees at their current depth of 200 meters, and Hendricks felt that familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied deep operations, that primal fear that evolution had hardwired into humans, who were never meant to venture into domains where a single structural failure meant instant death. But he pushed it down with practiced discipline. As the K-432's massive dark silhouette finally materialized through the Mystic's forward viewport, like some sleeping leviathan suspended in the eternal twilight of the deep ocean, the boarding operation proceeded with textbook efficiency for exactly 17 minutes, before everything began to unravel in ways that violated every protocol, every training scenario, and every rational expectation of what should be possible aboard a submarine that had been constructed according to well-understood principles of Soviet naval engineering. Hendricks led the team through the K-432's forward escape trunk, their magnetic boots clanging against the deck plating with sounds that echoed unnaturally through corridors that should have been filled with the ambient noise of operating machinery, but instead remained silent except for the barely perceptible hum of emergency lighting, powered by batteries that should have died weeks ago, and Rachel was the first to notice the smell. A peculiar combination of ozone copper and something organic and wrong that made her fight the urge to activate her respirator's chemical filters, even though atmospheric readings showed normal oxygen levels and no toxic gases. The command compartment stood completely empty, navigation charts still spread across plotting tables, cold coffee in enamel mugs sitting beside duty logs that ended mid-sentence in Cyrillic script, dated March 14th at 21:34 hours. But no bodies, no signs of struggle, no indication that 90 highly trained Soviet submariners had simply decided to abandon their posts simultaneously, and Liam ran his gloved hand across the captain's chair, finding it still faintly warm as if someone had been sitting there moments before their arrival, which was thermodynamically impossible given the ambient temperature and the time elapsed since the crew's disappearance. David moved toward the engineering section, checking reactor status indicators and finding them green across the board, cooling systems functioning normally, radiation levels within acceptable parameters, every gauge suggesting a perfectly operational vessel that just happened to be completely devoid of human presence. When Thomas called out from the communication station that the submarine's internal intercom system was active and drawing power, despite no one using it, the speakers emitting a sound so low in frequency that it registered more as pressure in their inner ears than actual audible noise. A subsonic rumble that made their teeth ache and their vision blur slightly at its edges. Andre pulled off his sonar headphones with startling violence and stammered that he was detecting acoustic signatures that made absolutely no sense. Frequencies cycling between 7 and 19 hertz, well below normal human hearing range, but precisely calibrated to resonate with human skeletal structure and internal organs. And the sound wasn't coming from the submarine's machinery, but seemed to be emanating from the hull itself, as if the metal were singing, as if the entire vessel had become a massive tuning fork, vibrating at frequencies that human bodies were never meant to experience. Rachel felt her nose begin to bleed, warm drops pattering onto her hand as she raised it to her face in confusion, and she saw that Liam's ears were bleeding too, thin crimson trails running down his neck, and the emergency lighting began to flicker in patterns that didn't correspond to any electrical malfunction, but seemed almost rhythmic, almost purposeful. And that's when they found the first body in the sonar room, and Rachel would later tell Navy psychiatrists that she wished to God they'd never opened that hatch. The Soviet sonar operator, whose name tag identified him as Starshina Dmitry Pavlovich Sokolov, sat upright in his station chair with his headphones still clamped over his ears, and at first glance he appeared merely unconscious until David stepped closer and realized with mounting horror that the man's eyes were open and filled with blood, not just bloodshot, but completely crimson, as if every capillary had burst simultaneously. and dark fluid had leaked from his ears to stain his uniform collar a rusty brown that indicated he'd been dead for at least 2 weeks. Rachel performed a rapid field examination with trembling hands, her medical training warring with visceral revulsion as she noted that Sokolov's body felt wrong to the touch, the flesh seeming to shift under her gloved fingers as if the internal structure had somehow become disconnected from the skin. And when she gently tilted his head back to check for airway obstruction, she heard a terrible wet crackling sound and realized with soul-deep revulsion that every bone in his neck had been pulverized into fragments, that despite his body maintaining its external shape internally, he'd been reduced to something approximating a bag of meat and shattered calcium. And the expression frozen on his face suggested he'd experienced agony beyond description before death finally claimed him. Thomas began hyperventilating, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he backed away from the corpse, and the subsonic rumbling that permeated the entire submarine suddenly intensified, climbing from barely perceptible to physically painful in the space of 3 heartbeats, and Andre screamed for everyone to stop moving, stop making noise because something was responding to their presence. Something was waking up in the metal around them, and Liam watched in absolute incomprehension as the steel wall beside him began to ripple like water-solid metal, flowing in concentric circles that spread outward from a central point as if something were pressing against reality itself from the other side of the physical world. The temperature in the sonar room plummeted so rapidly that their breath became visible in white clouds, frost forming on every surface with impossible speed, and Hendricks shouted for immediate evacuation, his command voice cutting through the rising panic. But Rachel stood frozen as she stared at the sonar display screens which had activated on their own and were showing something that couldn't possibly be real. A massive acoustic signature rising from directly beneath the submarine, something ascending from depths that registered as over 5,000 meters, something that wasn't registering as biological or mechanical, but as pure concentrated sound given form and directed intention. David grabbed Rachel's arm and physically dragged her toward the exit, as the rippling effect spread across multiple surfaces, shadows moving against the emergency lights in ways that violated every law of physics, and Thomas stumbled through the hatch first, his face sheet white and his eyes wide with primal terror, followed by Andre, who kept repeating, "It's in the metal, it's living in the metal," like a desperate prayer. And as Hendricks performed the final head count before sealing the compartment, he looked back one last time and saw Sokolov's corpse begin to vibrate in his chair, the dead man's jaw opening and closing rhythmically, air being forced through dead lungs and over dead vocal cords to produce a low moaning sound that almost formed words in Russian, almost sounded like a warning. And Hendricks slammed the hatch shut and spun the locking wheel with shaking hands, while his entire team stood in the corridor breathing hard and trying to process what they just witnessed. What their rational military-trained minds insisted couldn't possibly be real, but what their senses had experienced with undeniable clarity in that freezing chamber of death. Hendricks established a temporary command post in the K-432's mess hall, the largest open space they could find that offered multiple exit routes and clear sight lines in all directions, and immediately attempted to contact the Ortolan through their tether communication system, only to discover that while their equipment showed green status lights across the board, every transmission emerged as distorted static punctuated by bursts of that same subsonic frequency they'd encountered in the sonar room, as if something were actively jamming their communications or worse, listening to their attempts to call for help and deliberately interfering with the signal. Liam pulled out the emergency protocols handbook and began methodically working through the procedures for dealing with biological contamination, radiation leaks, and hostile boarding situations. But none of the established military responses addressed what to do when the physical structure of a submarine itself seemed to have become weaponized against human presence, when solid steel behaved like liquid, and dead men spoke through vibrating vocal cords, and his hands shook slightly as he realized that their training had utterly failed to prepare them for this scenario. Rachel set up a makeshift medical station and insisted on examining each team member, documenting the nosebleeds that Liam and Thomas had experienced, the severe tinnitus that Andre reported as a constant high-pitched whine in his left ear, and the inexplicable bruising that had appeared on David's forearms in patterns that looked disturbingly like handprints, despite no one having grabbed him with that kind of force. and she noted in her log with clinical detachment that masked growing dread that all of these symptoms were consistent with exposure to extreme infrasonic frequencies, the kind of acoustic weapons that both superpowers had been theoretically developing, but that weren't supposed to actually exist in functional form. David volunteered to investigate the engineering spaces more thoroughly, arguing that understanding the submarine's power systems might give them insight into what was happening, and despite Hendrix's reluctance to split the team, they agreed that knowledge represented their only potential advantage against an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't fight with conventional weapons. Thomas managed to isolate their communication equipment from the submarine's internal systems and finally established a crackling connection to the ortolan. But when he tried to explain their situation, the words sounded insane even to his own ears, and the response from Lieutenant Commander Sarah Breckenridge aboard the mothership was professionally skeptical, bordering on hostile. Her voice tight with barely contained frustration as she reminded him that they'd been sent to perform reconnaissance on a valuable intelligence asset, not to abandon the mission because of equipment malfunctions and stress-induced hallucinations. Andre sat hunched in a corner with his portable acoustic analysis equipment spread across his lap, running spectral analyses on the recordings he'd made, and what he discovered made his blood run cold in ways that had nothing to do with the submarine's frigid air, because the frequencies weren't random noise or mechanical vibration, but showed clear mathematical patterns, repeating sequences that suggested structure, that implied communication, that indicated something with genuine intelligence was producing these sounds with deliberate intent and possibly responding to the presence of living humans inside what it had claimed as its territory. David returned from the captain's quarters 30 minutes later, carrying a leather-bound journal written entirely in Russian Cyrillic script, his face drawn and pale, and explained that he'd found it locked in the captain's personal safe, along with sealed orders from Soviet Naval Command and what appeared to be technical specifications for experimental sonar equipment that bore classification markings he'd never seen before, even in captured Warsaw Pact documents. Liam, who'd studied Russian at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, and who'd spent 3 years as a naval attaché translator at the American Embassy in Moscow before joining the rescue service, began working through the journal with methodical intensity, his expression growing progressively more disturbed as he translated Captain Mikhail Dmitrievich Volkov's final entries, which read like a descent into madness, wrapped in technical precision and military discipline, gradually dissolving under the weight of inexplicable horror. The entries from March began routinely enough, documenting the K-432's deployment to conduct acoustic mapping of the Mariana Trench as part of Operacja Gromki, Operation Thunder, a classified program designed to develop ultra-low-frequency sonar capable of detecting American submarines at ranges exceeding 500 kilometers by exploiting the deep sound channel that existed at certain ocean depths. And Volkov wrote with obvious professional pride about the sophisticated equipment his vessel carried, describing transducers powerful enough to generate focused acoustic beams at frequencies below 20 Hz, with intensity levels that could theoretically incapacitate biological targets through resonant vibration of internal organs. The entry dated March 11th described the first test at maximum power conducted at coordinates 11 degrees 22 minutes north, 142 degrees 35 minutes east, directly above a section of trench floor that sonar mapping showed descending to 5.847 meters, and Volkov noted with scientific interest that approximately 40 seconds after initiating the pulse, they received an echo that shouldn't have been possible, a return signal from something at extreme depth that matched their transmission frequency exactly, but amplified it by a factor of 17. And when they repeated the test, the response came faster and stronger, as if something down there was learning, adapting, preparing. Liam's voice cracked slightly as he translated the March 12th entry, where Volkov described crew members beginning to complain of severe headaches, nosebleeds, and disturbing dreams about drowning in absolute darkness, while something sang to them in a language composed entirely of vibration and pressure. And the captain ordered the medical officer to examine the sonar operators who'd been most directly exposed to the experimental equipment, only to discover that 2 of them had sustained internal injuries consistent with prolonged exposure to hazardous acoustic energy. Despite all safety protocols being observed and all monitoring equipment showing radiation and sound levels within acceptable parameters, the entries became increasingly fragmented and desperate, as Volkov described how the submarine itself began to behave strangely on March 13th, with hull plating resonating at frequencies that made navigation instruments malfunction, with shadows appearing in peripheral vision that vanished when directly observed, with the entire vessel feeling as though it were vibrating at a level just below conscious perception. And he wrote in a hand that grew progressively shakier that whatever they'd awakened from the trench depths was not content to remain at crushing pressure 5 kilometers down, but was ascending slowly and deliberately, following the K432 as it attempted to flee toward shallower waters. The final coherent entry, dated March 14th at 2134 hours, contained a single paragraph that Liam had to read 3 times before he could bring himself to translate it aloud to the assembled team. We have sealed all compartments and killed main power in a desperate attempt to eliminate the vibrations that seem to attract it, but I can feel the entity moving through the hull itself now, existing somehow within the molecular structure of the steel, and my men are dying one by one in ways that our medical officer cannot explain. Their bodies found intact externally but reduced to pulp internally as if crushed by impossible pressure, despite our depth holding steady at periscope level. And I understand now what the ancient texts warned about, what the Micronesian fishermen knew to avoid, what happens when human technology disturbs forces that have dwelt in the lightless deep since before our species learned to walk upright on dry land. And to whoever finds this journal, I beg you, destroy these coordinates. Never return to this place. And for the love of God, never, ever use low-frequency active sonar in the Mariana Trench again. Because what sleeps down there does not forgive intrusion into its domain. Rachel had just finished processing the horrifying implications of Volkov's final warning when the emergency lighting throughout the mess hall suddenly dimmed to almost nothing, plunging them into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the pale glow of their equipment displays. And Andre's monitoring gear erupted with frantic alerts as he detected the same ascending acoustic signature they'd encountered earlier. But this time, it was exponentially stronger, broadcasting on multiple frequencies simultaneously, and he ripped off his headphones with a cry of pain as the intensity peaked beyond anything his equipment was designed to measure. The subsonic rumble returned with devastating force, no longer a barely perceptible pressure but a physical assault that made their internal organs vibrate painfully, that caused their vision to blur and their balance to falter as the fluid in their inner ears was literally shaken by acoustic energy passing through their bodies, and Thomas collapsed to his knees, vomiting violently, while Liam grabbed the edge of a table to keep from falling, as the entire room seemed to tilt impossibly despite the submarine maintaining level trim. David shouted something about the hull resonance reaching critical levels and they needed to evacuate immediately, but his words were nearly drowned out by a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a deep thrumming that rose and fell in patterns that felt almost like speech, almost like something attempting to communicate in a language composed of pure vibration. And Hendricks realized with crawling dread that the entity wasn't just hunting them randomly, but was actively trying to establish some form of contact, was testing them, learning from their responses, adapting its attack vectors with terrifying intelligence. The steel walls around them began exhibiting that impossible liquid rippling effect again, but far more pronounced than before, with waves of distortion spreading across every surface as if the submarine's entire structure were becoming permeable to something that existed partially outside normal physical space. And through these rippling surfaces they caught glimpses of shadows that moved with deliberate purpose, elongated forms that seemed to possess too many appendages, geometries that hurt to perceive directly because they violated fundamental principles of how objects should exist in three-dimensional reality. Rachel grabbed her medical kit and fumbled for the emergency flares they carried for signaling purposes, remembering from her hazardous materials training that certain wavelengths of intense light could disrupt acoustic phenomena, and she ignited one of the magnesium flares with shaking hands, the brilliant white light exploding through the darkness and causing the rippling distortions to recoil slightly, the shadows retreating toward the far corners of the compartment, as if the entity found the electromagnetic radiation of the burning flare painful, or at least uncomfortable, to its mode of existence. Hendricks immediately ordered everyone to activate their emergency flares, and the combined illumination seemed to create a temporary safe zone, a bubble of protection that gave them perhaps 30 seconds of respite, and he made the command decision that would save their lives, shouting for everyone to grab what equipment they could carry and make for the forward escape trunk immediately. Because staying aboard the K-432 any longer meant certain death, and as they ran through corridors lined with rippling metal and dancing shadows, Andre glanced back and saw something that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. Dozens of Soviet crew members' bodies emerging from sealed compartments, not walking but being moved by the vibrations in the metal itself. Their dead limbs animated like grotesque puppets, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams as the entity used their corpses to block the Americans' escape route. And he understood with absolute clarity that whatever dwelt in the crushing depths of the Mariana Trench didn't just kill, it collected, it studied, it learned from every victim it claimed, and now it was using its knowledge of human behavior to hunt the last living souls aboard this floating tomb with methodical, patient, utterly inhuman intelligence. They had barely made it 15 meters down the corridor toward the forward escape trunk when the entire submarine lurched violently, despite being in stable drift at periscope depth, throwing David hard against a bulkhead and causing Rachel to drop her medical kit, which burst open and scattered supplies across the deck plating that had suddenly begun to exhibit that terrifying rippling effect across its entire surface. No longer isolated patches, but continuous waves of impossible distortion that spread from bow to stern like some malignant infection, converting solid matter into something fluid and hostile. The subsonic assault intensified beyond anything they'd experienced before, climbing from painful to genuinely damaging, as Hendricks felt something tear inside his chest, tasted blood in his mouth, and realized with clinical detachment born of shock that the acoustic pressure was literally causing internal hemorrhaging, that his body was being vibrated apart from the inside out in slow motion, and he saw Thomas collapse completely, blood streaming from both ears and his nose. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites as convulsions racked his young body. Liam tried to reach the fallen communications specialist, but the corridor itself seemed to be fighting him, the walls pressing inward with muscular contractions that no steel structure should be capable of producing, the ceiling lowering by centimeters that accumulated into genuine danger of crushing, and through the rippling metal surfaces emerged not one shadow entity, but 7 distinct presences, each one slightly different in configuration, suggesting that what they'd encountered earlier hadn't been a single creature, but either multiple entities or one being capable of manifesting in multiple locations simultaneously, and the geometric impossibility of their forms became more pronounced as they solidified, revealing appendages that bent in too many directions, surfaces that reflected light in colors that didn't exist in normal visual spectrum, and a sense of massive intelligence focused entirely on the 6 humans trapped in this metal coffin, like insects in amber. The temperature fluctuated wildly from freezing cold that left frost on every surface to sudden spikes of heat that made the air shimmer and their sweat evaporate instantly, creating localized pressure differentials that popped their eardrums and made breathing feel like inhaling broken glass. And Andre screamed that the acoustic signature now registered across every frequency band simultaneously, from infrasonic through ultrasonic, creating a full spectrum assault that no biological organism should be able to survive for more than minutes before critical systems began failing. The emergency lighting didn't just flicker now, but pulsed in synchronization with the thrumming vibration, creating a strobe effect that made movement disorient. And through these strobing flashes, Hendricks caught glimpses of the Soviet corpses that had been animated by the entity's vibrational control, dozens of them emerging from every sealed compartment, their bodies moving with jerky puppet-like motions as they advanced down the corridor with arms outstretched, mouths gaping, and he understood with soul-crushing horror that the entity was using them not just as obstacles, but as acoustic amplifiers, channeling its frequency assault through dead flesh to create focused beams of devastating sonic energy that could target specific individuals. Rachel managed to ignite another flare, but this time the brilliant magnesium light barely slowed the advancing manifestations, the entities having adapted to this defensive measure and now pushing through the illumination with only slight hesitation, learning and evolving their attack strategy in real time with terrifying efficiency, and she realized they'd just taught this thing how to overcome one of humanity's few advantages, that every defensive action they took only made it stronger and more capable for the next encounter. David Kowalski, the unflappable Chicago engineer who'd survived 3 submarine emergencies and 2 house fires without losing his composure, pressed his back against a bulkhead and began laughing hysterically, a high-pitched keening sound that escalated into full psychotic break as he clawed at his own face hard enough to draw blood, screaming that he could feel the vibrations inside his bones, that his skeleton was singing, that every cell in his body was being played like an instrument in some cosmic orchestra, conducted by an intelligence so vast and ancient that human consciousness couldn't process its true nature without fragmenting into madness. Liam grabbed David's arms to restrain him from self-harm and felt the other man's entire body vibrating at a frequency perceptible through direct contact, felt bones grinding against each other in ways that shouldn't be possible, and the engineer's eyes showed no recognition, no humanity, only raw animal terror mixed with something worse, a kind of ecstatic understanding of forces beyond mortal comprehension that had shattered his rational mind like porcelain dropped on concrete. Thomas regained consciousness but immediately wished he hadn't, curled into fetal position with hands pressed over his ears, even though that provided zero protection against frequencies that bypassed the auditory system entirely and resonated directly through bone conduction and tissue absorption, and he whispered over and over, "It's talking to me, it's showing me things, it's been down there for millions of years, it's so old, we're nothing to it, we're just vibrations it can play with." His voice taking on a disturbing sing-song quality, as if he were channeling the entity's communication attempts through his own damaged vocal cords. Rachel's medical training screamed at her to help her team members, but her hands shook so badly. She couldn't maintain grip on her equipment, couldn't focus her vision properly because her eyes were vibrating in their sockets, couldn't form coherent thoughts because the subsonic assault was literally disrupting her brain's electrical patterns, inducing something between a seizure and a hallucinogenic episode, where she saw the corridor stretching impossibly long, saw her own hands aging and decaying in fast forward, saw alternate timelines where they'd never boarded this cursed vessel, and were safe aboard the Ortolan drinking coffee and laughing about some mundane complaint. Andre Baptiste had removed his monitoring equipment and sat motionless in a meditative posture that seemed wildly inappropriate for their circumstances, until Hendricks realized the sonar technician had achieved some kind of dissociative state, had mentally retreated so far into himself that the physical torture barely registered. And when Hendricks grabbed his shoulder and shook him, Andre's eyes opened but focused on something far beyond the submarine's hull, far beyond the ocean around them, and he spoke in a flat monotone that raised the hair on Hendricks's neck. "It doesn't want to kill us quickly because it's studying how we die, cataloging our fear responses, learning human physiology through systematic vivisection, and we're not the first intelligent species it's encountered down there in the darkness, just the most recent in a collection that spans geological timescales. And when we're gone, it will wait patiently for the next curious visitors to disturb its domain, because time means nothing at those depths where pressure and darkness and isolation have existed since the planet cooled." The submarine's internal structure began producing sounds that no mechanical system could generate, complex harmonic overtones that almost formed words in multiple languages. Simultaneously, Russian and English and others far older, suggesting that the entity was attempting genuine communication, but through a medium so alien to human experience that the message came across as pure existential horror rather than comprehensible meaning. And equipment throughout the vessel began operating on its own hatches opening and closing, in rhythmic patterns, valves, cycling pumps activating as if the K-432 itself had become an extension of the entity's consciousness, as if the boundary between the submarine and the thing that haunted it had dissolved completely. Hendricks forced himself to his feet through sheer force of will, every muscle screaming in protest, blood trickling from his ears and nose, and assessed their situation with the cold calculation of a commander who'd sent men to their deaths before, and understood that survival sometimes required sacrifice. And what he saw offered zero hope, because every possible escape route had been systematically blocked by the entity, or by the animated Soviet corpses that served as its physical agents, and the forward escape trunk that represented their only path to the mystic submersible and safety beyond, lay on the other side of a gauntlet of manifestations that grew more solid and aggressive with each passing second. Liam attempted to drag Thomas toward an auxiliary passage, but the young man's body had gone into full systemic failure, his skin mottled with subcutaneous hemorrhaging that spread like spilled ink. His breathing shallow and irregular as internal organs began shutting down under the sustained acoustic assault. And Liam made the agonizing decision to leave him, because carrying dead weight would doom them all. A calculation that would haunt him forever. But that represented the only rational choice in circumstances where rationality itself had become meaningless. David had stopped laughing, and now simply stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, occasionally making grabbing motions at shadows only he could see, his mind so thoroughly shattered that he posed no threat to others, but also offered no capability to assist in their survival. And Rachel tried one last time to reach him, to bring him back from wherever his consciousness had fled. But his eyes focused on her face and showed only blank incomprehension, as if he no longer remembered what she was or why she was speaking to him. The entity's manifestations converged from multiple directions, simultaneously coordinating their approach with pack-hunting intelligence that demonstrated they weren't just powerful, but tactically sophisticated, and Hendricks realized they'd been herded like cattle into this specific section, had been manipulated through their entire desperate flight to arrive at this precise location for reasons he couldn't fathom, but that filled him with dread, because it suggested the entity had specific plans that went beyond simple predation. The acoustic assault reached a crescendo that transcended pain and entered a realm of sensation for which human language possessed no adequate description, a frequency so perfectly calibrated to human biology that it felt like every atom in their bodies was being pulled in different directions, like reality itself was unzipping at the molecular level. And through the strobing emergency lights and rippling metal surfaces, Hendricks saw the entities coalescing into more definite forms, saw appendages reaching through impossible geometries to grasp at them, and he understood with crystalline clarity that they were witnessing the final seconds before the entity claimed them completely, before they joined the collection of previous visitors to these depths, whose dissolution had been studied and catalogued across millennia. Rachel grabbed Hendricks's hand and squeezed hard enough to hurt, a gesture of human connection in the face of inhuman annihilation. And he squeezed back, because what else could you do when confronted with forces so far beyond human comprehension that resistance itself became a joke, and the temperature plummeted to levels that should have killed them through rapid hypothermia. And the pressure seemed to increase, despite the submarine's depth remaining constant, and the shadows grew so dense they became almost tangible. And somewhere in the distance, Thomas released one final scream that cut off with terrible abruptness, and the vibrations intensified to a peak that felt like the universe itself was tearing apart. And Hendricks closed his eyes and waited for the end that seemed absolutely inevitable, that represented the only possible conclusion to their intrusion into domains never meant for human exploration. And the entity reached for them with appendages composed of pure concentrated sound, made manifest through mechanisms that violated everything physics claimed was possible. And in that moment of ultimate desperation, Commander James Patrick Hendricks, who'd never believed in anything beyond what could be measured and documented and understood through rigorous scientific methodology, found himself praying to whatever gods might exist in a cosmos vast and terrible enough to contain beings like this, praying that death would come quickly and that the entity wouldn't keep them conscious while it studied their dissolution, the way it had with the Soviet crew praying that someone somewhere would someday understand what happened here and ensure no one else ever made the same fatal mistake of disturbing the ancient intelligences that dwelt in the crushing darkness of the deepest trenches, where reality itself became negotiable and the laws that governed surface existence no longer applied. The salvation came from an utterly unexpected vector in the form of the USS Ortolan's emergency response that Lieutenant Commander Sarah Breckinridge had initiated 37 minutes earlier, when the Mystic's tether telemetry showed catastrophic vital sign degradation across the entire rescue team, a decision that involved deploying every active sonar system the ship possessed at maximum power output in a desperate attempt to locate and extract her people, and the massive acoustic bombardment from surface vessels using conventional 23 kHz frequencies created an interference pattern that disrupted the entity's precisely calibrated infrasonic assault in ways that pure chance and human desperation had accidentally weaponized against a being that existed as organized sound. The effect was immediate and dramatic as the 7 manifestations recoiled simultaneously, their semi-solid forms destabilizing and fragmenting as conflicting frequency patterns created destructive interference that seemed to cause them genuine pain or at least profound disorientation. And the rippling distortions in the submarine's metal surfaces began to recede like a tide pulling back from shore, and the bone-crushing subsonic pressure that had been seconds away from liquefying their internal organs suddenly diminished to merely agonizing levels that human bodies could theoretically survive if they received immediate medical attention. Hendricks didn't waste time questioning this miraculous reprieve, but immediately grabbed Rachel's arm and physically hauled her toward the forward escape trunk, his training taking over, even as his conscious mind remained fractured by what he'd witnessed, and Liam managed to half-carry, half-drag David's catatonic form, while Andre seemed to snap partially out of his dissociative state and stumbled after them on legs that barely supported his weight, all of them moving with the desperate coordination of prey animals that had been granted one impossible chance at survival, and understood on instinctive levels that this window of opportunity measured in seconds rather than minutes. They abandoned Thomas's body where it lay in the corridor, a choice that violated every principle of military brotherhood, and that would require official justification and unofficial therapy for years afterward. But the young man's corpse had already begun exhibiting that terrible vibration-induced deterioration that marked the entity's victims, skin-mottled purple-black with subcutaneous hemorrhaging, and flesh feeling wrong to the touch in ways that suggested internal structural collapse, and some primal survival instinct screamed at them that taking his remains might somehow allow the entity to track them, or that he'd become so thoroughly contaminated by its presence that his body now served as a beacon or anchor point for its attention. The forward escape trunk had never looked so beautiful as it did when they finally reached it. That cylindrical chamber representing not just physical escape, but psychological salvation from an environment that had become fundamentally hostile to human existence. And Hendricks initiated the emergency ascent sequence with shaking hands while Rachel performed rapid triage on their surviving team members, her medical assessment grim as she cataloged ruptured eardrums, internal bleeding, severe concussions, and psychological trauma that would require years of treatment assuming they lived long enough to receive it. The entity made one final attempt to reclaim them as they sealed themselves in the escape trunk, the subsonic assault surging briefly to near lethal intensity and causing Andre to scream and David to convulse violently. But then the Ortolan's active sonar swept across their position again, and the attack fragmented and dissipated like smoke and wind, and they felt the sickening lurch of rapid ascent as the emergency ballast system blew them toward the surface at speeds that risked decompression injuries. But that represented their only chance of escaping the K-432's increasingly unstable internal environment before the entity adapted to the sonar interference and resumed its methodical destruction of any living consciousness that dared intrude upon its domain. They broke surface 14 minutes later in a storm of foam and spray, the escape capsule's emergency beacon screaming across military frequencies, and USS Ortolan's recovery crew had them aboard within 6 minutes of surfacing, their battered bodies immediately triaged by ship's medical personnel, who documented injuries that made no sense according to conventional diving accident protocols, internal trauma patterns that looked more like victims of sustained high-intensity acoustic weapons testing than submarine rescue operations gone wrong. Captain Richard Thornton arrived in the sickbay within 20 minutes of their recovery, accompanied by 2 individuals in civilian clothing, who introduced themselves only as representatives of naval intelligence, and who began asking very specific questions about what the team had encountered aboard the K-432, questions phrased with such precision that Hendricks realized with sinking certainty that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Captain Richard Thornton arrived in the sickbay within 20 minutes of their recovery, accompanied by 2 individuals in civilian clothing, who introduced themselves only as representatives of naval intelligence, and who began asking very specific questions about what the team had encountered aboard the K-432, questions phrased with such precision that Hendricks realized with sinking certainty that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, that there existed classified protocols specifically designed to handle encounters with phenomena that officially didn't exist. Rachel sat wrapped in thermal blankets with an IV line feeding her fluids and medications while she gave her report in a voice stripped of affect by trauma and shock, describing the Soviet journal entries, the experimental sonar equipment, the entity that existed as organized frequency, and she watched the intelligence officers' faces remain professionally neutral in ways that confirmed they'd heard similar accounts before and knew exactly what she was talking about, even if they'd never admitted outside secure facilities with appropriate clearances. David Kowalski required sedation and physical restraints after he regained partial consciousness and began screaming about vibrations in his bones and trying to claw through the sick bay's bulkhead as if he could still feel the entity pursuing him through metal surfaces. And the ship's psychiatrist, Commander Helen Martinez, made preliminary notes about acute psychotic episode with dissociative features, while privately wondering what could traumatize a veteran submarine engineer so thoroughly that he no longer recognized physical reality as stable. Liam provided the most coherent after-action report, translating sections of Captain Volkov's journal from memory and explaining the technical details of Operacja Grumki with the precision of someone clinging to factual analysis as a defense against emotional breakdown. And the intelligence officers took extensive notes and asked him to repeat specific details about the coordinates, the frequencies used, and the entity's behavioral patterns in ways that suggested they were comparing his account against existing classified data. Andre Baptiste sat in silence for the first hour after recovery, staring at nothing until one of the intelligence officers made the mistake of playing back the acoustic recordings that had been automatically captured by the Mystic's external monitoring systems during their time aboard the K-432, and the sonar technician's eyes went wide with recognition and horror before he lunged for the playback equipment and smashed it against the deck with desperate strength, screaming, "Don't let it hear itself. Don't let it know we recorded it. That's how it learns, that's how it adapts," and required his own sedation before medical staff could safely approach him. The decision to destroy the K-432 completely came from levels of command so high that Captain Thornton received his orders through encrypted channels that bypassed normal chain of command protocols and at 1847 hours local time. On April 5, 1986, two Mark 48 torpedoes from USS Louisville, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine that had been quietly shadowing the operation, struck the drifting Soviet vessel at the waterline and reactor compartment simultaneously, and the resulting explosion and rapid flooding sent the K-432 plunging toward the ocean floor, trailing a plume of diesel fuel and debris that would serve as the official explanation for what satellites and distant observers might have detected. Hendricks watched from Ortolan's deck as the Soviet submarine's sail disappeared beneath the waves, for the final time taking with it 90 Soviet sailors, one young American communications specialist, and evidence of phenomena that governments on both sides of the Cold War had tacit agreement never to acknowledge publicly, and he felt no satisfaction in their escape, because he understood with absolute certainty that they hadn't truly escaped at all, that the entity had released them deliberately, that it had studied them thoroughly and learned everything it wanted to know about human physiology and psychology and tactics, and that it remained down there in the crushing darkness waiting with infinite patience for the next group of curious investigators to disturb its ancient domain with their primitive technology and their laughable assumption that they represented the apex of intelligence in Earth's biosphere. The official incident report filed with the Office of Naval Intelligence on April 12, 1986, classified at TS-SCI Spectre Blue access level, with dissemination limited to fewer than 30 individuals across the entire Department of Defense, attributed the loss of Seaman Thomas Riley to catastrophic equipment failure, resulting in rapid decompression trauma during deep submergence rescue operations, a sanitized explanation that bore no resemblance to the actual circumstances of his death, but that provided grieving family members with a narrative they could process without questioning their fundamental understanding of reality. Commander James Patrick Hendricks received a Navy Commendation Medal for extraordinary heroism during hazardous rescue operations under extreme conditions, was immediately reassigned to the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey as an instructor where his tactical knowledge could be preserved, while ensuring he remained under constant administrative observation, and found himself unable to sleep without heavy medication, because every time he closed his eyes, he felt vibrations in his bones and heard that terrible subsonic thrumming that spoke in languages composed of pressure and frequency rather than words. Lieutenant Liam Smith underwent 3 months of intensive psychological evaluation at Bethesda Naval Hospital under the official diagnosis of acute stress reaction with dissociative features, was eventually cleared for limited duty with the restriction that he never participate in submarine operations again, and transferred to Naval Intelligence's East Asia Division, where his Russian language skills could be utilized in analysis roles that kept him safely landlocked in Washington, D.C. Though colleagues noted he developed an irrational aversion to any room without multiple exit routes and would visibly flinch whenever building HVAC systems produced low-frequency rumbling sounds. Petty Officer Rachel Vance, whose medical expertise made her too valuable to simply discharge despite her psychological trauma, spent 6 weeks at a classified naval medical research facility in San Diego, where doctors studied her unique physiological response to infrasonic exposure and documented tissue damage patterns that appeared in no medical literature. Was eventually assigned to Naval Medical Center Portsmouth, where she worked exclusively with surface fleet personnel and refused all requests to participate in submarine medical research, and began experiencing severe panic attacks whenever she heard certain frequencies, including the resonant hum of MRI machines, the vibration of large ship engines, or even the bass notes of music played at moderate volume. Chief Petty Officer David Kowalski never recovered sufficiently to return to active duty, was medically retired in October 1986, with full disability benefits after 6 months of intensive psychiatric treatment, failed to restore his ability to distinguish between actual physical sensations and phantom vibrations that only he perceived, and spent the remaining 8 years of his life in a VA psychiatric facility in Massachusetts, where he filled notebook after notebook with complex mathematical equations describing frequency patterns and acoustic physics that professional physicists who reviewed his work admitted showed disturbing sophistication for someone with only high school-level mathematical training. Equations that seemed to describe resonance phenomena in materials under impossible conditions before he died in 1994 of what the official report called complications from chronic seizure disorder. But what the overnight nursing staff quietly described as having literally vibrated himself to death during what they assumed was a particularly violent epileptic episode. Petty Officer First Class Andre Baptiste demonstrated the most complete apparent recovery, returning to active duty after only 8 weeks of observation and resuming his role as sonar technician aboard surface vessels. But those who worked closely with him noted profound changes in his behavior, including an obsessive habit of monitoring ambient sound levels with portable equipment he carried everywhere, a refusal to ever wear headphones again even during off-duty hours, and a tendency to go completely silent and motionless whenever certain low-frequency sounds occurred naturally in his environment. And he quietly submitted his resignation from the Navy in 1989 and disappeared into civilian life working as an acoustic engineer for architectural firms where he could control sound environments rather than merely observe them. And his former shipmates who tried to maintain contact reported that he'd relocated to the high desert of New Mexico, specifically because the extreme elevation and lack of water bodies meant minimal infrasonic background noise. The physical evidence from the K-432 consisted of exactly 3 items that survived the torpedo strike and subsequent sinking: Captain Volkov's journal, which was immediately transported to a classified vault at Naval Intelligence Headquarters, where it joined at least 47 similar documents from previous incidents spanning back to 1958. The damaged sonar equipment from the Mystic that had recorded approximately 14 minutes of acoustic data before Andre destroyed the playback unit, which underwent analysis at a facility so classified that even the base commander of the installation where it was located possessed no knowledge of the research being conducted, and a single sample of hull plating from the K-432 that David had managed to cut free during their investigation, which metallurgical analysis showed had been altered at the molecular level in ways that existing material science could not explain, with crystalline structures that suggested exposure to vibrational frequencies far exceeding anything human technology could produce, and which remained in secure storage at the Naval Research Laboratory, where it occasionally exhibited spontaneous resonance phenomena that caused monitoring equipment failures and made researchers intensely uncomfortable during close examination. The coordinates 11 degrees 22 minutes north, 142 degrees 35 minutes east in the Mariana Trench remain permanently designated as Restricted Operating Zone 77 Tango, under authority of the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, with enforcement protocols requiring that any vessel, military or civilian, that approaches within 5 nautical miles be warned off immediately and forcibly diverted if necessary, and satellite surveillance shows that Soviet and later Russian naval forces maintain identical exclusion zones around the same coordinates, suggesting a tacit understanding between superpowers that some discoveries transcend ideological conflict and require cooperative suppression, regardless of geopolitical tensions. The philosophical implications remain so profound and disturbing that official policy across multiple nations maintains strict information control not to protect military secrets, but to preserve social stability. Because accepting that Earth harbors forms of intelligence that predate humanity by hundreds of millions of years, that exist in domains we can barely explore, and cannot hope to control, that regard human presence in their territory with the same hostility that humans would direct toward viruses invading their bodies, would fundamentally undermine every assumption about humanity's place in the natural order and our supposed dominion over the planet's environments. The survivors of the K432 incident, scattered across various mundane assignments and closely monitored for the remainder of their careers and lives, carried with them the burden of knowing that the official reality presented to the public represents a carefully curated fiction designed to prevent widespread panic, that beneath the waves exist intelligences as far beyond human comprehension as humans are beyond insects, and that every submarine that ventures into extreme depths, every experimental sonar system that probes the deepest trenches, represents a potential trigger for encounters with entities that have demonstrated both the capability and inclination to defend their territory with methodical, patient, absolutely devastating effectiveness. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.